Okay, I don't know where everybody is. Maybe one extra day off wasn't enough for people for Thanksgiving, and they wanted to stretch it into 2 weeks or something. I got your papers back to you today. Sorry it took a little bit longer. I had my 86-year-old mom in from out of town, and that sort of ate up a lot of the time that I thought I was going to be giving to grading. But they're back to you now with comments. So be sure that you heed those comments, pay attention to them. If you have any trouble seeing the marginal comments in your paper, let me know and I'll save it as a PDF and send it to you. And that way you'll be sure to see it. That's especially true if you're using something other than Word, right? I know they show up in Word and they should show up in other things, but I don't know because I don't look at them there. So that's important. I did want to take a second or two and talk about 4 or 5 common issues, and you might want to take notes on this as well, that a lot of the papers had, so it's worthwhile mentioning before we get back into the spread of surrealism. First and foremost, and I made this comment on your papers, but I want to sort of say it out loud, right? The picture that you chose is the focus of your paper, right? That's the whole point of the essay, is to have the reader understand that picture better. So the focus of your paper is not the biography of the artist, and you should be really merciless and cut anything that's in the paper that doesn't make a point that helps us to understand that picture better, right? So if there are other parts of the artist's career that you want to discuss to fill up the pages, that's kind of the wrong reason. You need to be discussing other pictures, biographical details, because they actually have an impact on what's going on in the picture that you chose. And if they don't, then they don't really belong there, right? Then it's time to get rid of them and find something else. And if you're filling it with stuff like that, that means you probably haven't yet looked at the right source, right? And so if you need some help finding better sources, come and talk to me. On some of your papers, I made very specific comments about look at this, right? If I had made comments on the revision of your bibliography, right, back when you turned the bibliography in and I made comments on that, right? If I said, hey, there's an article by so-and-so there, then, I'm not just trying to figure out how to use more of my time, right? I'm doing that because I think it's going to help. And you should really pay attention to those things when it happens, right? So remember that the picture is your focus, right? And the whole point of the essay is to help the reader understand your picture better, okay? The second thing is pay close attention to the introductions, right? This is in the instructions, but make sure that you have an introduction that establishes the focus, which is your picture, the one you chose, and establishes a direction for the essay. What are you going to talk about with this essay, right? So if I were writing an essay on Max Ernst and I wanted to talk about dream imagery, I would have an introduction that introduced the picture, maybe even described it a little bit, and then said, as a surrealist image, we're interested in dreams. This paper is going to discuss Max Ernst's own accounts of his dreams and how they affected our knowledge of the picture, right? So the introduction should leave no doubt in your reader's mind what they should expect in the rest of the essay. And that's why it's always good, or often good, to write the introduction last, because then you know what's in the essay, right? And you can tell us where to look. The second thing that, that's 2 things. The third thing that came up a lot is that people would often give me an introduction and they would begin to establish a focus and they would go somewhere else almost immediately. In the next 2 or 3 paragraphs, start to talk about a different picture or some biographical detail. I think that a good essay, a good art essay, and you might find this by reading essays on paintings as you're doing your research, is it goes from that introduction that says this is where we're headed, and really gets us interested in the picture at hand by giving us a description that gets the reader focusing on the things that you're going to analyze, focusing on the things that you're going to discuss. So in that case, I wouldn't, with Max Ernst, I wouldn't really talk about the frame. I might talk about the inscription, but more likely I would talk about the things that are in it and sort of get us thinking about those things, right? The twilight lighting, right? The indistinct day or night, the mysterious buildings, the strange scale discrepancies, right, between that kiosk and the figures, the juxtaposing of black and white and color, right? These things get us to think about what you're going to be analyzing, right? And what you're going to be discussing through your research and through your thinking. And that way, right, when we move into the other stuff, I know why you're bringing that stuff up. Because if you're introducing other things about the artist, right, then it should be very clear to me, the reader, why you're bringing those things in, what impact you hope that they have on my understanding of the picture. Because that's your job, is to demonstrate to me some deeper knowledge of what's going on in your picture, right? And show me that you're understanding it in a new way and leading me through how your sort of thought process in getting there. Okay? So really the first page of your paper ought to be pretty much subsumed with focusing on your picture in one way or another, because the other stuff is going to help us identify that better. So the introduction introduces your picture. The first paragraphs ought to get us into it a bit more deeply. And then you move into bringing in evidence that helps us understand what we're looking at, right? So use your words to get the reader to look at the things that you want them to look at, because there's often more there, right? You're not going to talk about everything. There's often more there than you plan to discuss. And the idea is to get us to look at it, right? Number 4, and this was regular. Don't make any claims without presenting evidence. Don't just give me conclusions, right? But discuss how that relates to your picture. Discuss what's the basis for this, right? So if Max Ernst had said, Max Ernst thinks birds are menacing. Okay, why do we know that, right? What's the evidence for that? And it's your job as a researcher to sort of ferret that out. You're either going to be hopefully finding something that Max Ernst himself wrote, or you're going to be quoting a scholar who's actually come to that conclusion. At which point you might say, as the scholar Johnson notes, this is a very important motif for Ernst, right? So don't just say claims, present evidence, and then discuss how that plays out, right? Don't just say it, but say, okay, how does that relate to my picture? I know that when I write, it's very, very easy to assume that my reader follows where I'm trying to go. And I often, in the final revisions of anything I write, figure out that I'm not doing a good job of leading them where I'm headed, right? And people who have read my stuff, we used to have a little writers group here on campus, right? Why are you doing this, right? Why are you presenting this evidence? Because I used to write essays as if I were some mystery writer, and all of a sudden I have the big reveal at the end, and all of a sudden, the butler did it, right? And they were saying, like, that's all well and good, but I couldn't figure out why you were presenting the evidence you were presenting, because you held back the lead, as journalists might say, right? So really think about the fact that part of your job is to lead your reader to understand your picture better, to follow your thinking. Right? That's the hardest thing in writing, and that's why we want you to do so much of it, is because later on in your career, you're going to have to write things that people are going to try to follow, and if they can't, then, your job application lays in pile B instead of staying in pile A, right? So make sure you present evidence to support any claims, and anytime you make a claim, be sure you're very clear about how that relates to what we're looking at, our understanding of the picture, right? Think about your paragraphs and how they're organized. I had mentioned before using reverse outlining. A lot of people could really sort of benefit from a solid outline. So use your draft to make an outline. See how it all fits together. You might find then that you've split up ideas over in 2 different places that really belong together. So, double check that stuff. And then finally, I think a number of people could really do, and I've written this on your essays, to consult. We have a writing center. Part of what you pay for with your tuition is the Learning Resource Center over in Rowley, right? Or what do they call it? CTL now, Center for Teaching and Learning, right? And there's a writing center in there, and you can make an appointment to sit down with your paper and with a writing specialist who can help you sort of play with things like organization, grammar, syntax, that sort of thing. And I think everybody could use help, right? None of us write great. We're not very few poets out there, right, that write that well. So I would recommend everybody scheduling an appointment over there. If you do go use the writing center, be sure that you take a copy of the assignment as well, because it's very hard for them to tell you what to do if they don't know what you've been asked to do, right? They might make you write a paper that you're not planning on writing, okay? So those are my comments, basically, on this. I would be happy to sit down with anybody in my office and go over the paper, talk about ways to strengthen it in great detail. I spend an hour with you going over it. I'm happy to do that. It's a small enough class that we can. Make an appointment with me and say, that's what I want to do, right? And we'll talk about sort of how to work things out in a fine-tooth comb. But give me a day of warning, then I can do this all the night before, and we can sort of talk it through, right, about how this is how I think this could be structured, rather than you watch me try to think and see the smoke come out of my ears, right? I mean, from the wheels turning, not from being mad, right? Okay, so is that pretty straightforward, right? So you got the comments. There's comments on the grading rubric. With the grading rubric, if the final paper most people did okay, right? If the final paper is significantly better, the grade of the paper will certainly bump up, right, from there. So if you've got like a B minus going, oh crud, what am I going to do now, right? What you're going to do now is do really good on the final paper, and if it's an A, your final grade for the paper will be much closer to the A. Okay? Because again, it's about learning, right? Okay? So that's the long and the short of all of that. Okay? We're going to continue talking about surrealism by looking at surrealism in America, because what that does for us is to push us, we're not there, these obviously are not Americans, but by looking at surrealism in America today, what that will do for us is to set the stage for abstract expressionism, because there's a very strong link between, we've seen already how many strong links there are between the different movements we've been talking about, right? That it's very hard to dissociate one from the other. Dada and surrealism, right? What's the difference? It's a manifesto and an interest in dreams, right, and subconsciousness. But, there are these incredibly tight connections. And what we're going to find is that surrealism, as it spreads to American art, sets the stage very strongly for abstract expressionism, right? Which will be sort of how we wrap the class up, because there's so much going on in ABEX, and we'll probably I'd like to have a field trip next week, right? And I'm thinking maybe next week Friday. Is that the last day of class? Yes, it is, next week Friday. So maybe next week Tuesday would be better, right? And so what I'll do is I'll send you an email this afternoon. If we're going to do it, I'll have to set it up like tomorrow, right? Because the provost office needs time to get it set up. So look for an email from me later this evening to confirm that next Tuesday you're not, we have a quorum. And keep in mind that you really want to come to that, because I can't record that, right, as easily or as well, or at all, really. Right, I don't have the technology for that. But I think it would be nice to talk about ABEX in person, okay? So, so anyway, surrealism. We've been talking about surrealism and its birth in Paris in 1924 with the manifesto written by André Breton, and it's being picked up by artists who come to Paris from other countries. Max Ernst, the German, Salvador Dali, the Spaniard, right, and really picking it up. And then we also, in our makeup lecture for the day off, we talked about how very well-established artists, Picasso, for example, are influenced by surrealism and take a different trajectory in their careers, particularly in the early mid-1930s, because of the impact of surrealism, and they start to investigate issues very much under the sway of this interest in dreams, mythologies, and how those elements lead us to an understanding of sort of subconscious ideas that might be buried under the logic of everyday life, right? And then we also, of course, looked at Kandinsky as another of these incredibly well-established artists who, even despite having a 30-plus year career of painting, still has room in his growth, right, to pick up the influence of surrealism, and very much influenced by Miro. What we'll see today is that indeed Miro is perhaps the most influential of all the surrealists, especially in America, but elsewhere. That his brand of surrealism. Remember that Andre Breton had said that Miro was the most surrealist of us all, right? The most surrealist painter out there, even though he's not the one that you think of, right? We all think of Dali. But Miro is, from a surrealist point of view, the ultra-surrealist, right? The best example of it. And his amorphic forms, right, these amoeba-like forms that come out of automatic painting have, again, this very, very strong influence on Kandinsky, who's willing to change his stripes in the last years of his life, right, in the 1930s. I think he dies in the early 40s, yeah? So there's a variation of surrealism in America as well. Here's Stuart Davis. He began as a sort of cubist artist in the teens, early 20s, but in the late 20s he begins to adopt surrealist approaches to art. In this particular image, it's one of a series of 4 paintings that he did. That's why it's called number 4, right? There is an egg beater number 1, 2, and 3, okay? What he did to paint this image in 1927, he began in November of 1927. We have a sketch for the very first one. It's dated, right? November 6th, I think, 1927. Is that he took a rubber glove and he nailed it to the table, right? Literally hammer and nail. Nailed it to the table, right on the tabletop, and it was immediately adjacent to an electric fan and an egg beater, right? Now, if you think about electric fans and egg beaters, right, they both are sort of a lot of space with wires around them, right? So a fan, if when you plug in the electric fan and it turns on, the fan part disappears, and you're left with this wire cage with something invisible inside of it, And an egg beater is kind of the same form, isn't it? It's a sort of rounded form of these, these two things that come together. The old school, egg beater like this, right? The kind you do by hand, right? That I had growing up, and I always see them at junk shops. I think they're pretty cool, but I know I'll never use it. I don't have that much space in my kitchen anymore, right? And for Stuart Davis, is seeing these are discordant objects, right? They're objects that don't belong together, which goes back to this originally a Dada idea, right? Of juxtaposing things in a way that sort of interrupts expectations, right? Interrupts the original meaning, avoids the original meaning. But for the surrealists, when they juxtapose these kinds of objects together, right, they tended to do it with a way of sort of revealing subconscious connections that we might draw, right? In the same way that a psychiatrist might play word association games with the idea that the word associations that you make draw connections, and the connections that you draw between them reveal modes of thinking that you may not otherwise be in touch with, right? So Stuart Davis is doing something similar in that he's juxtaposing things that make no sense. But I don't know, can you find it? Can you find the rubber glove, the egg beater, the electric fan? I'm hard-pressed, right, to do this, because for Stuart Davis, here's number 3, up in Boston, right? For Stuart Davis, the connection between these things is purely formal. He's surrealist in approach insofar as the juxtaposition of odd things side by side. But he's not surrealist in philosophy. He doesn't seem to be particularly interested in getting to some sort of deeper psychological understanding of the ego and the subconscious in a sort of Freudian manner, right? Like Dali might be. Rather, for Stuart Davis, the juxtaposition of forms in the still life that he creates are there specifically to open up compositional possibilities. In other words, at the end of the day, I think that Stuart Davis is as interested in formal challenges, compositional challenges, as he is in anything quasi-psychological. And I think that's part of the reason why in these images his forms, right, the rubber glove, the egg beater, the electric fan, all, for the most part, seem to disappear, right, into simple references that repeat and whatnot, but not in a way that are instantly recognizable. No, I've been blathering on. Can anybody make out any of those things in the image? Can you see a rubber glove? Can you see an egg beater? Can you see an old school electric fan? Other than the reliance on sort of wire-like forms, right? It's very difficult to pick this out.
It's abstract, in other words.
That's right. It's totally abstract. It's totally formal, right? Rather than... And I don't think by going abstract, he's doing a Kandinsky on us, right? Where he's trying to abstract it so that he reaches the spiritual nature behind it, the essence of it. I think he's abstracting it because he's interested in formal interplay, right? And you can see how elements of it sort of harken back to Picasso-like cubism. There's this, looks like almost like buildings or something, right? There's a bit of perspective, and each of them has that, see the part against the dark green in the Phillips picture? And how it's against the light blue. That almost looks like buildings in the distance, right? And the bit in the corner on the left, along the left edge, it almost looks like maybe the corner of the studio, you know. But the forms themselves then become these interplays of flat planes of color, right? Where built up in really very, very thick paint. And I'm hard-pressed. I was looking around online to see if anybody sort of analyzed, okay, over here is where it is. And I looked at all four of the Egg Beater series, and it's not like he gets more abstract as he goes along. This is it from the beginning, right? There's no sort of progression through them, even though ours is the latest of the four, right? Now, he is interested in surrealist art, and it seems as if, even if he's not, if his approach, if his philosophy isn't particularly surrealist, it does seem as if a surrealist work had something to do with the genesis of this piece. In 1927, there was a dealer in New York that was preparing the first major exhibition of de Chirico's work. Remember that de Chirico is sort of a proto-surrealist, right? Metaphysical paintings from the early 1910s that predate surrealism by a good 10 years, right? And there was this dealer who was really magnanimous, and by that I mean generous to artists. And as he was preparing this huge de Chirico show, he would let artists, and just really all the time, would let artists come in and see his inventory of paintings, right? So, you know, you're working on something, come and see what we got here. And the dealer, it wasn't Stieglitz, it was somebody else, right? Let Davis come in and see the paintings he's thinking about for this big de Chirico show in 27 in New York, right? And one of the works that was in the inventory but didn't make it to the show is the Song of Love from up at MoMA. And we know Stuart Davis saw it because there's a rubber glove nailed to the wall, oddly juxtaposed now with a classical bust. Right? And I should know exactly what sculpture that is. I think it's an Apollo sculpture, right? And I forget off the top of my head exactly which one. Not that it matters, right? But rendered in a space that is this totally de Chirico space, right? Of this sort of dreamy twilight atmosphere, an unexplained cloud in the background that could be coming from a steam engine or simply from a factory. Right, that ball in the foreground. And Davis is giving us an alternative, right? Inspired by this, but not copying it in any way. His variation on this pure composition that's developed from that surrealist or proto-surrealist idea of juxtaposing weird things, right down to the fact of the inclusion of the city in the background, right? All coming out of his experience with and his inspiration of Giorgio de Chirico. Right. Well, this experience in 27, right, beginning in the fall of 27, with surrealism seems to have inspired Davis to go to Paris. And he actually travels to Paris in 1928 at the height of surrealism. He stays there for about a year and a half. 28 to early 1930, Stuart Davis is staying in Paris. And so that puts him there, right? He gets there almost the exact same time that Dali arrives. And almost the exact same, well, Miro had already been there, about the same time that Magritte arrives from Belgium, right? It's really the heyday of surrealism is when Stuart Davis gets there. And the still life with the saw is painted after he gets back, right? And it presents us again. His style doesn't seem to have been altered by the trip by any means. But I think there are little things that are included here that suggest a stronger influence of Parisian surrealism as he's encountering it when he's abroad. So it's a nonsensical arrangement of objects. There's a mandolin, much more recognizable now, right? Paired with a saw, blue-handled wood saw. Other objects up at the top in green is a pair of calipers for measuring, right? Tongs that you use to measure woodwork, right? So we have these, what else do we have? Rope, right? What we have is this juxtaposition of objects that are musical objects, art objects, if you will, and objects that relate to craft or manual labor, rope, saw, and the calipers, right? That measuring. And it's almost as if the still life makes a juxtaposition between art and craft, art and, high art and low art, if you will. And we think on a certain level that's what Stuart Davis is doing, because a lot of his works, and I wish I had more time because I really like Stuart Davis, he has a good sense of humor. There's something witty about his works. And even the fact that he's got this egg beater number 4, and it's one of 4 objects, right, or 3 objects there, but that's what he calls it, egg beater. And I think, the idea, the theme, egg beater, right, it whips things up, right? It takes different objects and will meld them into one, right? That's what an egg beater does. If you use an egg beater on something other than just eggs. But if eggs, you get the yolk and the white, they all mix together in one. But you can also put an egg beater into 2 different kinds of flour, right, and whip them together, or eggs into flour or whatever, right? And the composition kind of does that as well, doesn't it? And it's an egg beater in itself, in that it's taken these different inspirations and it's whipped them into a composition, right? And on the right, still life with the saw, when in fact the most prominent object is the mandolin, right? It's sort of subverting expectation. It's a still life with the saw. It's not a mandolin. So on a certain level, he's downplaying the artistic object, the musical object, and enhancing and emphasizing the more mundane objects of manual labor or craft, saying that those are every bit as important. And by choosing a mandolin, I think he makes direct reference back to Cubism. He's now been in Paris, had a chance to see all of these things, some of them old, but they're new to him, right? And we saw how important guitars, mandolins, and violins, right, that same or similarly shaped objects were to the Cubists, right? And we talked about this Picasso when we covered Cubism with Picasso, but I think he's picking up the Cubist art object, right? And he's playing with the idea and making it less of a focus than the more mundane objects. And I think for Stuart Davis, part of this is a bit of a sense of humor. Right. The other person I think he's been looking at while he's in Paris is definitely Miro. So if you look at the rope or the calipers up above, or even just the sort of loose, casual, seemingly casual display of the objects across Davis's still life, there's something about it that suggests automatic painting. And I think on a certain level, those broken calipers up above that end up looking like legs with feet in the Stuart Davis owe something to Miro's automatic painting that become biomorphic forms, right? The horse tamer is the V shape on the left. Remember the woman that tames the man on the right. And then this seemingly casual array of the yellow, red, and white dots and that yellowish, probably intended to be a sperm-like thing, off to the right. And then we look at the background of Davis, and we see, you have to forgive the reflection on the glass there. That's not really part of it, but the other bits sort of seem as if it had been dropped there, you know? That same sort of casual arrangement is totally picked up by Miro, right? So Davis begins his career influenced by surrealism, or I should say, begins to be influenced by surrealism by seeing works of art in American collections with a dealer in New York. But then he enhances that interest. He enhances his interest in surrealism by actually spending time in Paris. And he channel us not only European modern movements, but particularly I think Miro becomes a major influence on his works. Not all American surrealism followed sort of the same path, right? Georgia O'Keeffe is discussed in a lot of different ways in art historical literature. I think for my money, this is the best place to put her, is with the surrealists. A very, very precise rendering, sharp-edged, right? Close-up of a plant form, red leaves, right? That by focusing on it, by enlarging it so much, right? And by focusing on the interplay of shapes and colors inspired by it, it renders this natural object with a sense of mystery. Almost imbues it with a spiritual power of its own, as if every element of nature has something wonderful and powerful. Right? Georgia O'Keeffe, is she overrated? She's good, right? Yeah, overrated, sure, but I think she kind of deserves it. You know, I think this stuff is really interesting. Because at the time, there are very few people doing something like this, where really, you know, Franz Marc is looking at nature, right, as a spiritual avenue. But he's looking at animals and from a traditional distance, right? They have a traditional space within the picture. They don't just, all of a sudden you got an eyeball covering the entire thing. And what O'Keeffe does is instead of looking out at nature and then changing the colors to come up with a, you know, some interest in something greater like what Matisse might do or Durant, right, would be to change the colors to get us to look at them differently. She instead zooms straight in on it, right, and uses that as there's a fancy word, a synecdoche of the entire thing, right? The small thing stands for the whole, right? A microcosm of the world. So all the forces of nature, right, in her hands are wrapped up in a single object, right, seen closely. You don't have to get back and see the majesty of nature from some hilltop to understand the power of nature, right? She picks it up by looking at it close up. Now, O'Keeffe never travels abroad, right? Her interests are entirely American. She's a deep-rooted American artist. But she did know European art very, very closely, very, very well. And the reason for this is that she was married to Stieglitz. So she had really quick and easy access to all the best European art because of her marriage. Now, this is not, I'm not saying that she's a great artist because she was married to Alfred Stieglitz, right? It's just, what's her avenue, right? For Stuart Davis, it was this dealer in New York, right, that showed him De Chirico, that got him going in that particular direction. For O'Keeffe, she is from the late teens onwards, sort of surrounded by modernist art because she was married to Stieglitz. Now, she may well have eventually found it on her own, but this is how she saw it. And remember that Alfred Stieglitz is arguably the most important figure in early American modern art. Arguably, not his works, but just everything else that he did, right? Running Gallery 291, hosting the first show of Dada art in America, hosting the first shows of Picasso and Braque and Gauguin, going back to, you know, some 19th century artists as well. He is instrumental in bringing modernism to America. Really, there are two major influences, right? There's Stieglitz and there's the Armory Show. Those are the two ways that Americans got to know modern art and either adopted it or didn't, right? And the ones that adopted it are the ones that are part of the circle. And you can't discuss Georgia O'Keeffe without talking about the fact that she's part of the circle, right? of artists that are benefiting from Stieglitz's effort to bring modern art to America, right? So, with this in mind, we should keep in mind that this very, very sharp-edged, precise rendering should, if we recall everything we know about Stieglitz, should come as no surprise, given that he hosts the first show of Picabbia's work. And we'd seen both Picabia and Duchamp are working with this sort of precisionism, right? And we talked about how their works are influential on the precisionism of American art in the 1920s. Sometimes O'Keeffe is discussed with the precisionists because it's not a big difference between the two, right? This way, and it's coming out of, again, through the modern art that that Stieglitz is introducing to America. So, right, Sheeler's classic landscape, Dada is everywhere, right? Dada just has such an influence on things, and with Sheeler's classic landscape, that precise rendering that Picabia had gave us precisionism, and O'Keeffe is often discussed that way, but that precise rendering can also be seen in surrealism, right? The sort of hyper-realistic look that you get, whether it's in a Dali, especially in Magritte, but other artists as well. Max Ernst, there's a sort of hard-edged realism to these things. And so as we're looking at works of art in the 20s and early 30s, I think part of it is because of Dada, but there's just amazing sort of the boundaries between the isms, right? They start to blur. There start to be these areas where could you talk about Magritte as a precisionist? Could you talk about Sheeler as a surrealist, right? What about Hopper, right? Is there something about his regionalism that owes a little bit to precisionism, owes a little bit to surrealism, right? That sort of mystery that he finds in the everyday. That melancholy. Remember, well, no, you don't remember. One of De Chirico's most famous works is called Mystery and Melancholy of a Street. That idea of mystery leading to sort of deeper thought process, dreams and whatnot. There's something very sort of profound about Hopper's imagery. So even though we talked about him as a realist, there are these incredible sort of cross-fertilizations and overlaps between these different movements in the 20s and 1930s. And again, I think it's all due to Dada, right? So O'Keeffe sort of fits into this, right? The precisionism that she sees in her works owes its genesis to the same source, but you can see how each of these artists is sort of going in different directions with this, right? And for O'Keeffe, it's almost entirely natural form, sort of natural phenomena, and in particular, sort of finding something spiritual in nature, right? And again, not doing it in the same way that an expressionist painter might do it, which would be to sort of look past nature to other forms, right? She sees within this precisely rendered form some sort of extraordinary spiritual power. And this is her sort of stock in trade, right? Are these close-ups of plant forms. So she does some broader landscapes as well. But these close-ups of plant forms are really her what she's best known for, right? Another close-up here. Jack in the Pulpit is, I believe, is part of the iris family, or the crocus family. So it has the flower part wraps around a very strong stamen in the middle. And she's now focusing on that, but you'll see that even though it's precisely rendered, she's allowing the natural forms to sort of take on a life of their own. And it's through the rendering that it becomes, she wants it to be alive, right? She wants nature to truly have a living presence. And she allows sort of the forms to morph away from precisely observed reality, the white parts of the flower, for example, that then take on this life of their own, right? So through close-up and through close observation, she's finding something that's not initially there. Now, this interest in close-up and sort of biomorphism is something she picked up from looking at numerous people that were part of the Stieglitz circle, right? So she's married to Alfred Stieglitz, the photographer. In addition to supporting modern painting, European painting, and modern Americans who do that, we Marsden Hartley, right? Max Weber were all part of the Stieglitz Circle. But he's also supporting art photography, right? With numerous shows of photographers working artistically rather than traditionally. And two of them that, as part of their work, did sort of extreme close-ups where the natural form starts to disappear and become something else entirely. Edward Weston and Paul Strand, right? Strand was particularly close to Stieglitz and O'Keeffe. They would vacation together all the time. And in fact, O'Keeffe's Jack in the Pulpit, that's a flower that grows Lake George, New York, upstate New York, which is where they would vacation together. And Paul Strand would go along with them as well. And so this driftwood in Maine, when you look at it more closely, all of a sudden starts to sort of become something else, right? You start to look into it with that same sort of, well, of course it's a photograph, right? But it's not out of focus at all. Everything is sharp and precise, and in looking at it, you start to see other things, bodies maybe. This is especially true with the bell pepper by Weston, right? A whole series of these where with the sort of low exposure, right, it ends up looking very much like a crouched figure seen from the back, right? That you find a sort of anamorphism, right? You know that term where one thing turns into the human body, right? Anamorphism. That O'Keeffe is also picking up on. And one of the things that people mention about O'Keeffe, and this is a little embarrassing, is that when she does this, she finds a female genitalia. That it's hard to look at these pictures and not think that as she looks closely at flowers, she starts to see vaginal imagery in great and almost scientific detail. So with the Jack in the Pulpit, she works through, in 1930, 1931, 6 different versions that as she works it, it gets more and more abstract. This is different from Stuart Davis, right, who kept reworking the composition to find other compositions. When she works in series, each one of the series increases the level of abstraction. And I think for her doing this, what she's trying to get at is the power that lies behind the form. And it's just, I'm sorry, I'm embarrassed talking about this in a room full of men. I'd be embarrassed talking about it, but I mean, it's just a big clitoris. Sorry, but that's the standard reading of these things. It's not like out there for Georgia O'Keeffe. That's what people giggle about, when they go and see them. It's, oh my God, look at that. And you'll notice that she focuses on the sort of the leaves swarming around and then that in the middle of it. And each one of them sort of pushing it further and further and eventually arriving at something that doesn't look like the flower at all. And then it actually kind of stops looking like vaginal imagery as well, and instead ends up sort of translating nature into this power of color and shape and form, right? And the idea is that she's discovering behind it something, and I think there's a particularly, I'll give you a second, Eleanor. Think of all the men that we've seen that have done vaginal imagery and how dangerous it's been. Think of Duchamp, right? And the bride strip bear and the praying mantis, right? And the idea that when women and sex are involved, Picasso, then men should be afraid, right? And for O'Keeffe, it's very, very different from that, right? For her, it's about the power of nature itself, Mother Nature, I guess, in itself. Eleanor.
I recently saw a Georgia O'Keeffe exhibit, and Waltex was saying she disputes all those claims.
I know, they always do, don't they? Who else did we talk about? There was somebody else we were talking about not too long ago. Oh, it was Brancusi, right? Remember Constantine Brancusi, the sculpture that looks like a penis, right? And it's called Princess, right? And it's just like a big dildo, right? And he said, no, that's not at all what I meant. Yeah, she does, but I think, do you believe her? Do you think?
Well,
Do you
it's
think she's right?
complicated when assume that that's what she's painting. I don't know. I had a lot of very complicated thoughts about it, so I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's okay to be complicated about it, and I think insofar as the denial is concerned, let me just say this about that. It's quite, I'm not saying that she's lying, but I've seen so many artists, whether in any medium, music to visual art, deny things that are pretty freaking obvious, right? When Caravaggio says that nobody ever influenced him, and he's quoting Michelangelo, whose first name is Michelangelo, it's come on, right? Come on, Mike. Don't try to put one over on me, right? And, there was this band that my wife was listening to, Belle and Sebastian, and she was really into them years ago. And they also went on an interview and said, well, we're not influenced by anybody. And they're just like, no, I can hear it right there. I'll play them back to back for you. You can, things that came out of when I was in high school. Right? Anyway, long and the short of it is, I've always felt that when artists deny something, you better look twice. Namely because they're trying to deflect from what their true inspirations might have been. I agree that I also have a hard time looking at these and not thinking that that's their supply. I just think the visual evidence, the last ones are not so much, right? But the red leaves and the first one and then this one, I don't know, and then if it was only one picture, I'd say, okay, we've gone over it. But it's fairly, with the flower pictures especially. The other thing is, of course, is that, when we talked about the orifices, right, this golden section, we talked about how certain forms just repeat in nature. Could we just talk about that as well? That maybe there's just some way in which biomorphic forms resemble other biomorphic forms, right? I mean, Weston thinks that bell pepper looks like a back, right? And she would have known what he was saying about that too. So that also adds into the mix, right? If she's around these other artists who are working in very similar themes, but not with that, right? That's partly because the Stieglitz circle wasn't nearly as, well, the people that were tied to Stieglitz weren't this creepy, sexist Dada Cubist group, right? They might have been influenced by that, but they weren't those kind of people, right? Picabia is much safer than Duchamp in a lot of ways, even though there's still a lot of sexual innuendo there. Right? And the fact that there's so much sexual innuendo in Dada and Dada-inspired art, Dada surrealism, right? It's just blatant. Maybe, this is tough, right? It's a tough thing. But it's worth discussing, and it's much better as a learning experience than a lecture. Right? What was I going to say before I said that? I lost my train of thought. It just went like, boom. I paused to meta comment, and I lost what I was going to say. And it was good. It was really good. Not just filling the air. Nature, sex, human body parts. I forget now. Could it be that hers is a comment on all the other stuff and wants to say, that she's willing to find. I don't know. I don't know where to go with it. Right? It's complicated.
It seems like she could have taken some really, it's just interesting that she denies it. She could have taken it in really interesting directions if she was owning it and being like all these men in the past have painted women's bodies in weird ways.
Time period too.
Sure,
If something like this happened nowadays, it can be taken with a completely different perspective than when it was in this time.
And I think that's the other thing, right? To think about what's happened in the 50 years since the women's movement started, right? Or 45 years since the women's movement started in the early 70s. How much more comfortable we are with sort of psychoanalysis as well as part of the way we approach art as a psychoanalytic way, where maybe she didn't mean it, but it came out anyway, as things do in psychoanalysis, right? We talked about automatic painting, and the fact that painting as an act in the surrealist's eyes can allow you to see things that you didn't see coming, right? The whole idea of automatic painting is it leads you somewhere that you didn't plan. That maybe she didn't intend that, but it did later there anyway, And I think that Jesse brings up a very good point, which is this, in the 1920s and 30s, also as a woman artist, does she really want to be defined as the woman artist who paints women's body parts and finds them in plants everywhere? That I wouldn't want to be defined that way. I wouldn't want to be defined as the guy, if the tables were turned and there were 90% women artists and 10% men artists, I wouldn't want to be the guy that found penises everywhere, right? Although probably that's what you're going to write in your reviews, he sees penises everywhere. But anyway, I can see how she would not want that to be her definition, right? And would maybe more adamantly deny it simply because that becomes then, well, she's got to do that because she's a woman, and that's how the male art world might see that in her. Right? And again, it's also, I think, the big thing. I would be curious as to when she said it too, because she was around forever, right? And if she said that in the 70s, or if she said that in the 30s or 40s, or even in the 20s, that would affect sort of how I would interpret that comment too, right? And I think part of it is that how do you want to be defined? And part of what an artist's statement is, right? And when you write them for your senior show next year, right? Or yours in the year after that, right? When you write your your artist statement, you get to say, this is how I want to be, this is how I want people to look at my art, right? And vocal statements are the same thing, right? Where you get to say, this is really what I want. And this is why some artists just refuse to say anything, because they just assume not lock it down, or they'll say things that are extraordinarily cryptic, where there's a lot of postmodern artists who will say things and there's no point in reading it because it just doesn't get you anywhere. And I would think that Gauguin kind of falls into that camp. I think Duchamp kind of falls into that camp as well. They don't want to explain, They want to affect how you look at it, but not in a sort of telling you what to see. Long aside, right? But it's worthwhile sort of thinking about how do we take what artists say about their works when it seems to contradict what we can see in their works, right? Well, this idea of and we can go back to something else, which is the general idea about finding something spiritual by using abstraction, which is typical, right? Using abstraction as a way of getting to the spiritual in nature, okay? And that even when she's precise and realistic, she's still kind of doing that. She's looking for the spiritual not in broad landscapes so much as in every element of nature. And that idea of looking at nature, big and small, and finding spiritual elements is something that is there in other artists working in the 20s and 30s as well in America. So there's an American surrealism that really gets caught up in this idea of natural phenomena and abstracting that natural phenomenon to achieve an insight into sort of broader spiritual forces. So Arthur Dove, I only sort of got into him about 3 years ago, but I'm a big Arthur Dove fan now. And I had an argument with friends about Arthur Dove versus Stuart Davis, right? And I'm a big Arthur Dove fan. Some of his works will get down like George O'Keeffe does and stick their nose in the mud and sort of look between, the blades of grass to find elements that become the inspiration for something that attempts to get at the broader spiritual forces that aren't immediately apparent. And with Dove, he often includes as well these sort of automatic painting-inspired shapes, like the tendrils that we see going off to the right or the spots up above, that emphasize this. Also, Dove, part of the Stieglitz Circle, he had actually gone to Paris as early as 1907 and had actually exhibited with the Fauves in 1907, 1908, right? Before coming back. He's actually, one of his works that I've seen from like 1908 is one of the very, very earliest works to be utterly non-objective, just color, right? Comes back to America, begins to paint things he can see in the world around him, but like O'Keeffe, he's investigating it for these insights into a greater spiritual power. We know with Arthur Dove from his own writings that he's a theosophist. Now, we haven't talked about this in weeks, right? But remember that when we looked at Mondrian, Kandinsky, Malevich, right? 3 different artists, 3 different active countries. Malevich and Kandinsky are both Russian, but Kandinsky acted mostly in Germany, that all of them were influenced by this idea of theosophy, this ancient philosophy that all religions are based on, that believes in some sort of abstract order behind the chaos of the world. Right? Dove's pictures show us the world and yet translate that into something that turns into dance, right? That finds this order in the face of chaos. Right? And it's not only small, he looks big as well. These are such fantastic landscapes, right? These are wonderful things. Probably both the same landscape, my guess, from the fields down below that we see, the red sun of a sunset, the morning sun on your right. And in each of them, you can see that what he's interested in is not illustrating what the sun looks like, but sort of getting to what it feels like, right? The power of the sun. So this swirl pattern that he traces onto the sun, how the fields on the left end up looking very much like a striped carpet on the floor. On the right, just a blaze in the sky, right? The sun is. And then when we look close, it's this sort of swirling bead of white and black, right? Which the black makes the white that much brighter. The white makes the black that much darker. And what he's interested in is capturing this extraordinary sense of the power of nature. And so very much falling into what O'Keeffe was doing, right? Very, very similar to hers. I didn't put this up here, but early on in his career, he was dead broke, Arthur Dove was. He was a deckhand. He lived in a boat in a harbor, Long Island, and Huntington Harbor. And he had absolutely no money, but he worked sort of as a deckhand, right? He would just fix people's boats for them and whatnot to make the ends meet. And early on, Duncan Phillips, after whom the Phillips collection is named, Duncan Phillips, discovered his works and fell in love with them. And he gave Arthur Dove an annual retainer in order to have what they call the right of first refusal. So, Alan, if you were a painter, and I was like a very rich painter, I was like, Alan, I will give you $100,000 a year. And all I want is the right to say, yes, I want to buy that before you offer it to anybody else, right? The right of first refusal. And the Phillips collection has like 30 Arthur Doves, and they're all spectacular. They're all really, really good. And it's all because Duncan Phillips was paying him. He was his sugar daddy, if you will, right? Paying him for the right to say, I get it. Anything that came off the easel, he got first dibs at it, right? So that's how these both wound up there. Oops, sorry about that. I am particularly fond of this image on the right, and I'm sorry, that was supposed to come up after a click there. Me and the Moon, and I think when we look at both of these, we can see the impact of Miro with the sort of lyrical line that almost appears as if it's automatically painted. In other words, where he doesn't, he's letting it trail where it may. How the line at the top, for example, then he goes back and paints that with these different bits of bleeding paint throughout. And how, even though it's the moon, he's not illustrating the moon. And there's no sort of explanation for what those things are, those beads that seem to float in front of him, right? He's picking up things that he's really borrowed very much from surrealist pictures. Right? The title, and this is true for a lot of his work, right? He said what he was trying to do as a painter, right, was make music for the eyes, he said. He actually said his paintings were very much like music. And that through these explorations of abstract forms, of surrealist forms, he was hoping that we would see nature as a rhythm, right? Nature as music. And so Me and the Moon, I found out, was actually the title of a song, right, that had been released a year before. So I found a YouTube video. I'm going to try and make it play, and we've not had a lot of success with this in the past, but we'll see what happens now if I can get over there. Oh, I gotta go this way, I think. There we go. So if I can aim this, I can play it, and we'll see if we get sound up there or not. This is a song that I just watched the picture, right? I think it's just perfect. You know that Paul Klee used to say that he would dance when he painted? Like there was one point when he was painting and the neighbors downstairs came up to complain. He goes, "I'm sorry, I often dance when I paint. I didn't realize I was doing it." Right? But that idea, playing music while you work really comes through with this, right? I think of a musical analogy, just watching those lines and letting your eyes sort of slowly go by them. Right? It's almost like watching a electronic meter sort of show you the thing of the music. Well, you get the idea, right? We have two other American surrealists to look at. Alexander Calder is perhaps the most famous of them all, him and Georgia O'Keeffe. Calder, right, goes to Paris, 1926, stays there for 7 years, all the way to 1933. He's in Paris in the middle of the Surrealist movement. And he starts his career by making these really whimsical, very funny little wire sculptures made out of just bent wire. And we've got 5 or 6 of them. I brought this one because I love the cow pie, right? The little bent wire cow pie as well. And you can see how small it is by the fact that my camera's out of focus on the head, right? And I'm sorry about that. But you'll also notice that certain parts of it dangle, right? The udders will actually move if you shake it because they're sitting on rings that hang from the bottom. And is that another cow pie waiting to drop up there by its butt? I think, yes, it is, right? Very, very funny little work. And in these sort of wire outline with this whimsically drawn, right? It's almost like drawing in a way, isn't it? Bending wire for the outline is really very much like having a pen on paper. But I think that there's sort of a childlike humor and fun it's really very similar to Paul Klee. And we've seen that a lot of the surrealists are interested, as Sigmund Freud was, in getting back to childhood memories as a time of pre-logical innocence. And I think Calder fits that, right? That has that idea of play, right? And psychoanalysts will tell you as well that play, if we study how we play, is a great avenue for understanding who we are, right? As a society, as an individual, if we study modes of play, we can understand more than we might think we would. And I think Calder is sort of tapping into that idea with his surrealist works. Now, when he was in Paris, he, in addition to making these wonderful little wire sculptures, he actually made a little circus out of little figures that was animated, that the little things would move, right? Calder's Circus. And he went around to the Dada and the Surrealist people, and they just thought this was the coolest thing they had ever seen, right? And I kept reading about it. I'd never seen it, and I found a YouTube video of Calder's Circus. So I'm going to play that for you. This is about 5 minutes, but it's worth seeing. So I'm going to try again to get over there, go this way, and play it. So this is about, like I said, about 5 minutes long. But it's Calder's Circus. And there's not much in the way of sound on it, right? So it's a 1955 film of what he was doing back in the 20s when he was in Paris. Imagine him as a younger man. Right? And he would go around to people's houses and set this thing up, right? And do these little performances. again, it's like discovering childhood again, right? And really thinking about it. So Duchamp saw this, right? He was playing for everybody in Paris, and they were flocking to him. And the surrealists loved it. Duchamp goes over and he sees it as well. And it was actually Duchamp that coined the term mobile, right? We use that for sculptures that move, right? But the term had never been used before. And it was Alexander Calder's circus that inspired the term mobile, right? And we should keep in the back of our mind this idea of these moving parts in the circus as we look at the other Calders that we're more familiar with, right? Because we'll start to see these abstract shapes floating in the air, the famous mobiles that we see all everywhere, right? And for Calder, these things are in fact, circus. And the circus was such an important theme for modern artists, right? Think Picasso, right? But for the surrealists in particular, the circus is this place where nothing is as it seems, right? Where masks don't hide who you are, but they reveal who you are. Does that make sense? Right? Clowns get to do things under makeup that we all wish we could do, right? Or nature is forced to do things it's not supposed to do, right? Lion tamers with Miro, right? The circus is a really rich theme of strangeness. The surrealists just absolutely adore. It's a great line, isn't it? Mop head. So, as we think about the things that we know better from Calder, right? The actual mobiles that we're used to, we should remember that he got his start sort of making these little wire sculptures and animating them, and finding within the different shapes and their interconnections. And also, think about how much measurement and technology something that would take, right? To figure out exactly how that crank's going to work and how to get that lion to stand up on its hind legs, right? And he brings that same sort of precision to his mobiles. And so here in the early 30s, he's now back in America, right? He moves back in 33, but he continues to make these things through the 1930s. And they stand away from the wall, and they have this intricately arranged interchange of shapes, right, that have become now abstract. They're no longer circus animals, but that doesn't mean he doesn't think about them that way, right, as potential actors on the stage that are interacting in ways that he's sort of defined, right? But also, you can't define because this moves, right? The things that are hanging, that S-shaped pattern moves. That amoeba form on the right will turn. You can see one side of it is black and the other is white. And the only reason it turns is because people walk by and the air fluctuates in the room. And that causes these things to shift in space, right? It's very easy when you look at these things to think of Miro. I'll bring in some more Miros we haven't seen. And how important Miro is for the development of American surrealist artists, that his forms look like Miro forms. And they knew each other. I found a picture of them in the 60s hugging each other at an opening in 1967. I should have brought it in. But Calder's, if it were a painting, could easily be a Miro, because we have these different forms floating against a colored background, right, that are interacting with each other in a sort of random way. For Miro, it's from automatic painting, right? For Calder, that idea of opening it up to chance is through the way in which it moves through space. I don't know why that's coming up now. I was hoping I would have that with another work. Hang on a second, I got to go back and fix something here. Well, I'll tell you what, we only got 2 minutes left. We'll fix this up. He has a direct dialogue going on in the 40s with Miro. And we'll come back to this and look at exactly what that dialogue is on Friday. That's going to set us up on Friday to begin talking about American abstract expressionism, because this is where this is going to lead us. This interest in Miro, this interest in surrealist issues is going to push us directly into some of the issues that the abstract expressionist artists Pollock and Rothko, right, are dealing with. And so I'm thinking that Tuesday will be a really good day to go to the museum, and that way, potentially, we can use Friday of next week, our last day in class, to sort of talk about the final, right, rather than covering new material. So I'm going to email you tonight, but think about it now. We're going to try, if we can, on Tuesday next, to leave as soon as we can, right, as soon as you can get here. So that's what the email is going to ask, is how soon can you meet at the main house, right, and meet us for a cab there. And then they'll book the cab tomorrow. Okay? All right, I will see you then on Friday.